My name is Megan Fletcher, and this happened when I was 22 years old in Nottingham, England. Even now, years later, I still think about that night whenever I hear a door creak open in an empty house. At the time, I was a university student trying to earn extra money through babysitting. I had worked for the Thompson family several times before. They were friendly, their 2 children were well behaved, and their house was in a quiet neighborhood where nothing ever seemed to happen. One Saturday evening, Mrs. Thompson called and asked if I was available to watch the kids while she and her husband attended a friend's anniversary party. I agreed immediately because I knew the family well. I arrived around 6:30 p.m. The parents left shortly after 7. The children, Emily and Jack, spent an hour watching cartoons before I put them to bed. By 9 p.m., both were asleep. The house became incredibly quiet. I settled into the living room downstairs and started watching television. Around 10:30 p.m., I went upstairs to check on the children before making myself a cup of tea. That's when I noticed something strange. At the far end of the hallway was a bedroom door that was slightly open. Earlier that evening, Mrs. Thompson had specifically told me not to worry about that room because it belonged to her oldest son, Daniel, who was away at university. I clearly remembered the door being shut. At first, I didn't think much of it. I walked over and pushed it closed. Then I checked on Emily and Jack. Both were asleep. I returned downstairs. About 20 minutes later, I headed back upstairs. The door was open again, not wide open, just enough to reveal a dark gap between the frame and the door. I stopped walking. For a moment, I wondered if I had imagined closing it. Maybe. I had only pulled it halfway shut. Feeling slightly embarrassed for creeping myself out, I closed it again. This time I made sure it clicked firmly into place. I even turned around and looked at it twice before heading downstairs. At 11:15 p.m., I went upstairs for another check. Door was open. My stomach tightened. I walked quickly to Emily's room. She was asleep. Jack was asleep too. The house was completely silent. I stood in the hallway staring at the door. Part of me wanted to open it and look around, but something felt wrong. Instead, I shut it again and returned downstairs. By now I couldn't focus on the television anymore. Every small sound made me glance toward the staircase. The old house occasionally creaked as it settled, but everything suddenly seemed louder. A few minutes before midnight, I heard something. A faint noise from upstairs. It sounded like a footstep. I muted the television. Silence. Then another soft sound. I grabbed my phone and slowly walked toward the stairs. Halfway up, I looked down the hallway. The bedroom door was open again, this time wider than before. I felt cold all over. I wanted to believe there was a logical explanation. Maybe the latch was broken. Maybe there was a draft. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I checked the children again. Both were sleeping peacefully. As I stepped back into the hallway, I noticed something that made my heart nearly stop. Inside the dark room, I thought I saw movement just for a second, like a shadow pulling back. I immediately retreated downstairs. My hands were shaking. I locked the front door, even though it was already locked, and texted Mr. Thompson. Quick question. Does anyone else have a key to the house? I expected a simple answer. Instead, my phone buzzed almost immediately. Where are the kids? I replied, sleeping upstairs. A few seconds later, another message appeared. Get them. Leave the house. Call police now. I stared at the screen, then my phone rang. Mr. Thompson sounded terrified. He told me there had been a man who rented Daniel's room several years earlier. The man had developed an unhealthy obsession with the family and had eventually been arrested for stalking-related offenses. He had recently been released from prison. Earlier that week, neighbors had reported seeing him in the area. Nobody thought he knew where the family lived anymore. Apparently they were wrong. My chest felt tight. I whispered, "You think he's inside?" Mr. Thompson didn't answer immediately. Then he said, "Just get out!" I ran upstairs. Every second felt dangerous. I scooped up Jack, woke Emily, and told her we were playing a game where we had to be very quiet. The three of us hurried down the stairs. As we reached the front door, I heard something behind us, a slow creaking sound coming from upstairs like a door opening. I didn't look back. I grabbed the children and ran to a neighbor's house across the street. Police arrived within minutes. The officers searched the property while we waited outside. Nearly 30 minutes later, one of them came out. The expression on his face told me everything. They had found a man hiding inside the closet of Daniel's bedroom. According to police, he had entered through an unlocked rear window before the parents left. What terrified me most was what they discovered afterward. The man hadn't been wandering around the house. He had spent nearly the entire evening inside that room. Each time he heard me come upstairs, he would quietly open the bedroom door and watch me through the narrow gap. Then he would close it and return to the closet before I approached. The final time, when I thought I saw movement in the darkness, I had actually seen him. The officers later told me he was standing just a few feet behind the door, watching, waiting. To this day, I don't know what his intentions were, and honestly, I don't want to know. What scares me most isn't that there was a stranger hiding in the house. It's knowing that for hours, while I thought I was alone, someone was silently watching every move I made from the darkness at the end of that hallway. This happened when I was 19 years old. I've told this story a few times online, and people usually assume I'm exaggerating or leaving details out. I wish that were true. Unfortunately, everything I'm about to describe happened exactly as I remember it. At the time, I was earning extra money by babysitting for families in my neighborhood. One Friday night, my neighbors, the Andersons, asked if I could watch their 2-year-old son, Ethan, while they attended a wedding reception in downtown Portland. It seemed like the easiest babysitting job imaginable. There was only one child. He was already tired. The parents planned to return shortly after midnight. I arrived at around 7:30 p.m. Ethan fell asleep before 9. The Andersons showed me how to use the baby monitor and told me to call if anything unusual happened. I laughed and told them not to worry. Looking back, I wish they had worried. The house was small and quiet. After Ethan went to sleep, I settled into the living room with a blanket, some snacks, and a movie. Everything felt normal. At around 11:45 p.m. For a second, I heard a strange crackling sound coming from the baby monitor sitting on the coffee table. At first, I didn't think much about it. The monitor was an older wireless model. I assumed it was interference. The static continued for a few seconds before stopping. Then everything became quiet again. A few minutes later, the sound returned. This time it was louder. The crackling was followed by a brief burst of feedback. Then I heard something else. A voice. A man's voice. Very faint, almost like a whisper. "He's asleep." I sat upright. The words were clear enough that I knew I hadn't imagined them. I stared at the monitor. The room suddenly felt colder. My first thought was that the device was somehow picking up another monitor from a nearby house. That seemed like the most logical explanation. I picked up the monitor and adjusted the volume. The voice disappeared. I laughed nervously and went back to my movie. 10 minutes later, the monitor crackled again. This time the voice returned. The babysitter's downstairs. I froze. My heart immediately started racing. There was no way that was random interference. The words were too specific. I muted the television. The house became completely silent. I listened carefully. Nothing. No footsteps. No sounds from upstairs. No movement outside. Just silence. I grabbed my phone and sent a text message to Mr. Anderson. Hey, weird question. Has this monitor ever picked up voices before? There was no response. They were probably still at the reception. I stood up and walked through the house, checking every door and window. Everything appeared locked. The backyard was dark. The front yard was empty. I told myself there had to be a simple explanation. Maybe somebody nearby was using a similar monitor frequency. Maybe I was tired. Maybe my mind was connecting unrelated things. Then the monitor crackled again, and the voice spoke. He's looking at the monitor now. Every muscle in my body tightened. I nearly dropped the device. The voice wasn't guessing. Whoever was speaking knew exactly what I was doing. I immediately looked around the room. The curtains were open. Anyone outside could potentially see me. I rushed to the windows and closed every curtain in the house. My hands were shaking. I picked up my phone and called Mr. Anderson. No answer. I called Mrs. Anderson, straight to voicemail. For a moment I considered grabbing my keys and leaving, but Ethan was upstairs asleep. I couldn't abandon a child. I took a deep breath and headed upstairs. The stairs creaked beneath my feet. Every sound seemed amplified. When I reached Ethan's room, I quietly opened the door. He was asleep in his crib. Everything looked normal. I stepped inside and locked the bedroom door. Then I called 911. The dispatcher listened carefully as I explained what was happening. To my surprise, she took it seriously immediately. She asked me to remain inside the room until officers arrived. While waiting, I sat beside the crib and listened. The monitor rested on the floor. For several minutes, nothing happened. Then the static returned. The voice came back. Only this time it sounded closer, much closer. Police are coming. My blood ran cold. How could he know that? I hadn't said anything aloud. The dispatcher was speaking through my phone. Nobody should have known. Then the voice said something that terrified me even more. He's in the nursery. I looked around the room in panic. Closet, window. Under the changing table. Every shadow suddenly seemed threatening. I checked the closet. Empty. I checked beneath the crib. Nothing. Then I heard a sound outside, a faint scrape, like a shoe dragging across dirt. The nursery window faced the backyard. Slowly, I moved toward it. The curtains were partly open. I pulled them aside just enough to look out. At first, I saw nothing. Then I noticed movement. A dark figure standing near the fence. Watching the house. Watching this room. I jumped back instantly. The dispatcher heard me gasp and asked what happened. Before I could answer, the figure disappeared into the darkness. Less than 3 minutes later, police cars arrived. Red and blue lights flooded the street. Officers searched the property while I remained inside with Ethan. Eventually, they escorted me downstairs. I expected them to tell me it was a prank. Instead, one of the officers looked genuinely disturbed. They had discovered fresh footprints directly beneath Ethan's bedroom window. The tracks had been made recently. Very recently. The person had been standing there for an extended period of time, looking into the nursery, watching. But the story became even stranger. Police examined the baby monitor system. They discovered it had been modified. Someone with technical knowledge had found a way to connect to the monitor remotely and transmit audio through it. The voice had not been coming from another house. It had been intentional. Someone had been communicating through the device. Someone who knew exactly where I was. Several days later, Investigators reviewed nearby security footage. They identified a man who had been seen repeatedly walking through the neighborhood during the previous month. He wasn't related to the family. He wasn't a neighbor. Nobody knew why he had chosen that house. The most chilling discovery came from the timeline. According to investigators, the man had likely been watching the Anderson family for weeks, long enough to learn their routines, long enough to know when the parents would be gone, long enough to know a babysitter would be inside. The suspect was never caught. Police believed he left the area after that night. Years have passed since then. I still think about those words sometimes. Not the first ones, not even the second ones. The words that haunt me are the last ones. Police are coming. Because it meant he wasn't simply watching the house, he was listening closely enough to know exactly what I was doing, exactly where I was, and exactly when help was on the way. To this day, whenever I see a baby monitor, I remember that voice coming through the static. Calm, patient, almost amused. As if the person outside wasn't afraid of being caught. As if he simply enjoyed letting me know that he was there. This happened when I was 24 years old, and it remains the most frightening experience of my life. I've shared this story online before because even years later, I still think about how close I may have come to something terrible. At the time, I regularly babysat for a wealthy family I'll call the Beckers. They lived in a large modern house in a quiet suburban area outside Hamburg, Germany. I had been babysitting for them for almost a year. The parents trusted me. The children knew me well. I knew the house, the routines, and every creak in the floorboards. Nothing about that evening felt unusual when it began. Mr. and Mrs. Becker were attending a business dinner in the city. They left around 7 p.m., leaving me with their 2 children, 8-year-old Jonas and 6-year-old Emma. By 9 p.m., both children were asleep. I cleaned the kitchen, made tea, and settled into the living room with a book. Everything was quiet. At approximately 9:30 p.m., the landline phone rang. That wasn't unusual. The Beckers still used a landline for business calls, I answered. A man's voice greeted me politely. Good evening. Have Mr. and Mrs. Becker already left? The question seemed normal. I assumed he was a friend or colleague. Yes, I replied. The caller immediately hung up. I stared at the phone for a moment. It felt slightly rude, but I didn't think much about it. An hour later, the phone rang again. The same voice, calm, polite. Are the children asleep? I frowned. Who is this? The line went dead. Now I felt uneasy. I checked the doors. Everything was locked. I walked upstairs. Both children were asleep exactly where they should be. Nothing looked wrong. I returned downstairs and tried to ignore the strange feeling building in my stomach. At 10:45 p.m., the phone rang again, the same voice. This time there was no greeting. Jonas is in the room facing the garden. My heart skipped. The caller continued. Emma sleeps across the hallway. I couldn't speak. Those details were correct. Very few people would know that. The voice remained calm, almost friendly. Then the caller hung up. I immediately called. Mr. Becker. No answer. I called Mrs. Becker. Straight to voicemail. They were probably inside a restaurant where they couldn't hear their phones. For the first time that evening, I began to feel genuinely afraid. Locked the front door again even though it was already locked. I checked every downstairs window. Then, I turned off most of the lights and looked outside. The neighborhood appeared completely normal. Streetlights, parked cars, silent houses, nothing unusual. At least that's what I thought. Shortly after 11 p.m., I noticed something strange. A dark sedan was parked 3 houses down the D street. The vehicle looked familiar. I couldn't remember why. The car remained there for nearly 30 minutes. Its headlights stayed off. Nobody appeared to get in or out. Then it suddenly drove away. I felt relieved. Unfortunately, the phone rang again moments later. The same voice, looking out the front window won't help. The blood drained from my face. Hadn't told anyone I was looking outside. I slowly backed away from the window. The caller chuckled, softly, not loudly, not like a movie villain, just enough to let me know he knew I was frightened. Then the line disconnected. I called the police non-emergency number. I explained everything. The operator suggested that it might be a prank caller, but agreed the situation was unusual, and officer said they would drive through the area when available. That didn't make me feel much better. Midnight approached. The house seemed quieter than ever. Every sound felt amplified. The refrigerator humming, the ticking of a clock, the wind brushing against the windows. Then the final call came. 7 a.m. I answered with shaking hands. For several seconds there was only silence. Then the man's voice spoke. "You're in the kitchen right now, aren't you?" I froze because I was standing beside the kitchen sink. The room suddenly felt ice cold. Slowly, I turned toward the dark window above the sink. Nothing, no face, no movement, just darkness. Then the caller added something that terrified me even more. "You should move away from the window." The line went dead. I immediately dropped to the floor. I crawled away from the kitchen and called emergency services. This time police treated the situation much more seriously. Several patrol units arrived within minutes. Officers searched the property, the garden, the garage, the neighboring streets. At first they found nothing. Then one officer asked me a question. Had any contractors recently worked at the house? I remembered something. Months earlier, a landscaping company had completely redesigned the Becker family's garden. New plants, new pathways, new fencing. The police began investigating that lead. While searching the area, officers located the same dark sedan I had seen earlier. It was parked several streets away. Inside they found binoculars, maps, a notebook, and a man who had previously worked for the landscaping company. The discovery shocked everyone. According to investigators, the man had spent weeks observing the property. Because he had worked there before, he knew the layout of the house. He knew where the children's bedrooms were located. He knew which lights were usually left on. He knew the family's schedules. The notebook contained pages of observations, departure times, school, routines, business trips, even notes about me. One page simply read, "Regular babysitter, female, usually arrives before 7. I felt sick when police told me that. But the most disturbing detail came later. The investigators discovered that the man hadn't chosen that evening. Randomly, he had been watching the family for months, waiting for a night when the parents would be gone for several hours, a night when only a babysitter would be inside. The phone calls weren't just meant to scare me, they were tests. He wanted to know whether I was alone, whether I was paying attention, whether I would panic, whether anyone else was inside. Fortunately, the repeated calls gave police enough time to respond before he acted on whatever plans he may have had. I still think about one thing. The caller could have remained silent. He could have watched from a distance without revealing himself. Instead, he wanted me to know he was there. He wanted me to understand that he knew the family's routines better than I did. And for several hours that night, he proved it. Whenever I hear a phone ring unexpectedly late at night, I still feel a small knot form in my stomach, because I remember standing alone in that kitchen, looking into a dark window, knowing that somewhere out there, Someone was watching me, and knowing far more about that house than any stranger ever should.